Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining me in this session of Spokane Public Schools Keep Learning series for literacy. Today's lesson is for all of our fourth graders out there, and any child who is interested can join us. My name is Sarah, and I'm an instructional coach at Cooper Elementary in Spokane Schools, and I'm so happy you joined me for this lesson today. If you didn't see our previous lesson, you can find it on the KSPS website. You can still tune in to today's lesson even if you haven't seen any of our others. Today we will continue learning how to integrate information from two texts on the same topic. The topic is civil rights and includes two different texts, one a biography about a woman determined to gain voting rights for women, and the other an informational text about the U.S. Constitution. For today's lesson, you will need a piece of paper and something to write with. I'll wait as you gather your materials. Let's take a look at our learning target. Read it with me. I can integrate information from two texts on the same topic. So today, we're going to look at how the role of the Constitution relates to I could do that by thinking of these two questions. How did Esther Morris affect the Constitution of Wyoming? And how did she change the role that women played in Wyoming? We're going to prepare ourselves to answer these questions in the end by writing a response to them after we read. Yesterday, we compared the two texts and the information in the text so that today we can integrate the information from both of them in a written response activity. Go ahead and write these questions down on your paper. Let's begin reading I Could Do That by Linda Arms White, pictures by Nancy Carpenter. In 1820, 6-year-old Esther McQuigg studied her mother making tea. I could do that, she said. Make tea? Asked Mama. The older girls do that. But I want to learn, said Esther, and she did. She pumped water into the kettle and set it on the wood stove to boil. She scooped tea leaves into the teapot, then poured steaming water over them. Esther strained the tea into cups, one for her mother, one for herself. As they sat near the window of their New York house, Esther saw men riding by in their best suits, some carrying flags. Where are those men going, Mama? Asked Esther. They're going to vote for the next president of the United States, Mama said. Will Papa vote? Yes, Papa always votes. Will you vote, Mama? No, dear, only men can vote. When Esther was 8, she watched her mother sew a fine seam. The needle pulled thread in and out, tracking tiny, even stitches across the fabric. Esther felt her hands mimicking her mother's. I could do that, she said, and she did. She made clothes for her doll from scraps, and when her stitches became neat and straight, she sewed a shirt for Papa. When Esther was 11, her mother died, and for the first time she saw her father cry. He gathered his 11 children together. I don't know what we'll do without your mama, he said. I'm depending on each of you to be brave and to take care of one another. Esther, 8th of the 11, cried too. But then she said, I can do that, Papa, and she did. When Esther was 19, 6 feet tall and on her own, she earned a living making dresses with leg of mutton sleeves for society ladies. When the ladies wanted hats to match the dresses, Esther designed and made those too. Soon she thought of opening a millinery shop. You are much too young to run a business, she was told. I don't see why, was Esther's reply, and with that she opened a hat shop in Owego, New York. Esther started attending abolitionist meetings at her church, but a throng of people who believed in the right to own slaves threatened to stop the meetings even if they had to tear down the Baptist church where they were held. You can't do that, Esther said. I'll stop anyone who tries. When Esther was 28, she married Artemus Slack, and a few years later had a son they called Archie. But when Artemis died in an accident, Esther made a big decision. I'm moving to Illinois, she told her friends. I'll claim the land Artemis owned there and raise our son. You can't do that, her friends cried. Illinois is the very edge of civilization. It's full of dangerous people and wild animals. Yes, she said, I can. And that was that. In Illinois, she fought long and hard to claim Artemis's land, but was denied her inheritance because she was female. So Esther opened another hat shop. Esther met and married John Morris, a merchant and immigrant from Poland, and in 1851 she gave birth to twin boys Edward and Robert. But John had a hard time making a living. So while Esther raised the children, cooked the meals, and washed the clothes, she helped earn the money too. When Esther was 46, she went with John to the presidential election polls and watched through the window while he voted. You know, she told him when he came out, I could do that. Politics is the business of men, my dear, he said. Said Esther, it's our country too. When war broke out between the northern and southern states, Esther was proud that Archie joined the victorious fight of the North to end slavery. Soon after, an amendment to the Constitution granted African American men all rights of citizenship, including the right to vote. When Esther heard Susan B. Anthony speaking out about women's rights, Esther began to hope that someday women might vote too. In 1869, when Esther was 55, she and her 18-year-old sons moved to the newly formed Wyoming Territory, where John and Archie, who'd gone there the year before, waited. Esther and the boys traveled by train across miles of prairie, then by stage over rocky hills to South Pass City, a dusty, hurriedly built town where gold had been found. Most of the 2,000 people who lived there were rowdy young men. The Morrises moved their belongings into a small log cabin, and South Pass City became home. John tried his hand at another business. Archie bought a printing press and started a newspaper. Esther opened another hat shop. But with 6 men to every woman, there was always a need for someone to nurse the sick and wounded, sew clothes, help deliver babies, and give motherly advice to the few young women in town. I could do that, Esther said, and she did. One day, Esther read a proclamation tacked to a wall. All male citizens 21 and older are called to vote in the first territorial elections. Esther looked around at the disorderly young men. It's time I did that, she said. When Esther's sons watched her march toward home, they knew it was more likely that things were about to change than that things would stay the same. Esther invited the 2 men running for the territorial legislature to her house to speak to the citizens. Then she sent out invitations to the most influential people in the territory. Come for tea and talk to the candidates. She scrubbed her tiny home from top to bottom, washed the curtains, and ironed her best dress. When the candidates and guests arrived, Esther served them tea. One thing I like about Wyoming, she said, is how everyone is important. It takes all of us to run the town, women as well as men. Yes, her guests agreed. And it's a place where people aren't afraid to try new things. Her guests agreed again. Esther smiled. She turned to the candidates. Then would you, if elected, introduce a bill in the legislature that would allow women to vote? Suddenly, in that tiny room full of people, not a sound was heard. Finally, Colonel William Bright spoke. Mrs. Morris, my wife would like to vote too. She is intelligent and well educated. Truth be told, she would be a more informed voter than I. If I'm elected, I will introduce that bill. Not wanting to be outdone, the other candidate, Herman Nickerson, also agreed. Applause broke out in that tiny cabin, and Esther dropped to her chair. Thank you, she said. People warned her that once the bill was introduced, the men at the legislature would have to approve it, and the governor would have to sign it. This had never happened anywhere. Why did she think it could happen here? But Esther had seen that things that were not likely to happen happened every day. She wrote letters and visited legislators to make sure this bill would happen too. And it did. On December 10, 1869, Governor John Campbell signed this bill into law. Wyoming women got the vote. Yeehaw! Yippee! Hurrah! Hurrah! Women across the country rejoiced for the women of Wyoming, but some people didn't like it. Only 8 days later, Judge James Stillman, the county's justice of the peace, turned in his resignation. He refused to administer justice in a place where women helped make the laws. Word went out that a new justice of the peace was needed. Esther's boys turned to her. "Mama, you could do that," they said, and so she applied. Archie, then clerk of the court, proudly swore his mother in, making Judge Esther Morris the first woman in the country to hold public office. But Judge Stillman refused to turn over the official court docket to Esther. "Never mind," she said. "Archie, will you please go to the mercantile and buy me a ledger? I'll start my own docket." And of course she did. On September 6, 1870, 1 year after her tea party, Judge Esther Morris put on her best dress and walked with her husband John and her sons down the dusty street to the polling place. She would be one of 1,000 Wyoming women voting that day, the first ever given that right permanently by any governing body in the United States. As they walked, John, who still didn't think women should vote, tried to coach her on which candidates and issues to vote for. Esther held up her hand. "I can do this," she said, and she did. So let's just remind ourselves about those two questions we will be answering at the end when thinking about how the role of the Constitution relates to "I could do that." The first question was, how did Esther Morris affect the Constitution of Wyoming? How did she change the role that women played in Wyoming? So we could use the information from this first text we read to answer these questions, but we really want to think about what we know about the Constitution first to answer these questions. That's why we'll read this next text, The Role of the Constitution, by Carl DeSoto. The Constitution. A constitution is a plan of government. A government is a system of leaders and laws by which a community, state, or nation is governed. The United States Constitution sets up the national government. It says that all citizens should be treated fairly by government. It says that their freedom should be protected. Each state has a state constitution that sets up the government for that state. A state constitution must obey the United States Constitution. It cannot take away rights granted by the United States Constitution. The Constitution sets up the United States government as a democracy, which means that the people elect leaders to govern them. The government gets its power from the people, so it is a republic. Citizens elect leaders to represent them in government. The three branches. The United States Constitution organizes the national government into three branches or parts. These three branches are the legislative branch, the executive branch, and the judicial branch. Likewise, each state has a government divided into these three branches. The Constitution tells what each branch of the government can and cannot do. The legislative branch makes national laws and is made up of Senate and House of Representatives. The executive branch enforces national laws led by President of the United States. The judicial branch makes sure laws agree with the Constitution and is made up of Supreme Court and other courts. Rights and freedoms. The United States Constitution provides rights and freedoms for American citizens. The Bill of Rights is a part of the Constitution. It lists the many rights and freedoms of American citizens. These freedoms include the freedom of the press, freedom of speech, and freedom of religion. It also protects Americans accused of crimes by giving them the right to a trial by jury. One important right is the right to choose leaders and make decisions by majority rule. Under the Constitution, each citizen who is at least 18 years old gets one vote in an election. The winner is the person or idea that gets the most votes. Duties of citizens. Americans' rights are balanced by duties. For example, the right to choose leaders is balanced by the duty to vote. The right to a jury trial is balanced by the duty to serve on a jury. The government provides services for American citizens. It maintains the military to protect the country in times of war. It helps people rebuild their communities after natural disasters. In return, citizens have the duty to pay taxes. The money from taxes pays for the cost of running the government. The Constitution gives the government the right to collect taxes. This graph shows the percentage of people eligible to vote who actually voted in presidential elections from 1960 to 2008. When we take a look at the role of the Constitution, on the first page it said in that first paragraph that all citizens should be treated fairly by government. It says that their freedom should be protected. So let's take a look at our first question when talking about how the role of the Constitution supports I could do that. The question is, how does the information from the role of the Constitution help us understand how Esther Morris affected the Constitution of Wyoming? So after reading that paragraph in the role of the Constitution and learning that how the U.S. Constitution provides and protects the rights and freedoms of citizens, this helps me understand that Esther Morris affected the Constitution of Wyoming by making it fair for all citizens, because all means women too. The Constitution of Wyoming was changed to include all citizens having the right to vote. Let's take a look at our next question. How does the information from the role of the Constitution help us understand how Esther changed the role that women played in Wyoming? On page 671 of the role of the Constitution, at the top it says each state has a state constitution that sets up the government for that state. A state constitution must obey the United States Constitution. It cannot take away rights granted by the United States Constitution. So let's look at our question again. How does the information from the role of the Constitution, we just looked at that information from that text, help us understand how Esther changed the role that women played in Wyoming? Go ahead and write your response. I wrote that the information from the role of the Constitution helps us understand how Esther changed the role that women played in Wyoming because the text states in paragraph 2 that each state has a state constitution that sets up the government for that state, and that a state constitution must obey the United States Constitution. This tells us that Esther's actions not only changed the role that women played in Wyoming, but this also eventually caused change for the roles of women across the entire country. So even though Wyoming was the first state to allow women to vote, eventually the entire country allowed women to vote. And each state has to obey the U.S. Constitution. So, did we integrate information from two texts on the same topic today? We did. We used information from the role of the Constitution to support the information from I Could Do That, both texts being about civil rights. I've enjoyed doing some literacy learning with you again today. Thank you for joining me as you keep learning from home. I look forward to seeing you again for another lesson on KSPS. Bye.